Sarah was fired for giving bread to a homeless man. The millionaire laughed. But when the old man stood up, his laughter froze forever. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this. The crystal chandeliers of Montclair restaurant cast dancing shadows across white tablecloths as Sarah Bennett balanced 3 plates on her left arm while carrying a wine bottle in her right hand. Her feet ached in her practical shoes, but she maintained the professional smile that had kept her employed for the past 18 months. At 28 years old, she had learned that survival meant swallowing pride, ignoring rudeness, and never ever complaining about the customers who treated her like furniture. "Finally," snapped the woman at table 7, not bothering to look up from her phone. "We've been waiting forever." Sarah placed the plates down gently, though her internal clock knew it had been exactly 8 minutes since they'd ordered. "I apologize for any delay. Please enjoy your meal." The woman waved her away dismissively, already turning back to her conversation about vacation homes and yacht clubs. Sarah retreated toward the kitchen, her smile fading the moment her back was turned. She had served these people before, knew their patterns, understood that no matter how quickly she moved or how perfect the service, they would always find something to criticize. "Table 12 needs water refills," called Marcus, one of the other servers, rushing past with his own impossible load of dishes. Sarah grabbed a pitcher and headed toward the dining area, her eyes automatically scanning the room for any raised hands or impatient gestures. That's when she noticed him. An elderly man sat alone at table 15, tucked in the corner where the golden lighting didn't quite reach. His hands trembled slightly as he studied the menu, and Sarah could see the worn edges of his jacket, the careful way he held himself, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. She had seen that posture before, in the mirror during her worst months, when every meal was a calculation and every bill a potential disaster. "Sarah!" Margaret Chen's sharp voice cut through the ambient restaurant noise. The manager stood near the host stand, her expression tight with barely contained frustration. "Victor Ashford just arrived. He's requesting his usual table, but there's a problem." Sarah's stomach dropped. Victor Ashford, the man who spent more on a single meal than she made in a week, who treated servers like they existed solely for his amusement, who had once sent back a perfectly cooked steak 3 times just to watch the chef's face turn red with frustration. "What problem?" Sarah asked, though she could already see it unfolding. Victor stood at the entrance, his expensive suit catching the light, his silver hair perfectly styled. Next to him stood a woman Sarah recognized from previous visits, Rebecca Stone, his business associate, wearing an expression of practiced boredom. But Victor's attention was fixed on something across the room, his face darkening with disgust. "That," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, pointing toward the elderly man in the corner. "That person is sitting at my table." Margaret's professional mask slipped for just a moment. "Sir, that gentleman arrived first. We can offer you table 9, which has an equally excellent view." "I don't want table 9, Victor interrupted, his voice rising. "I want my table. The table I've been sitting at every week for 5 years. The table I essentially pay for with what I spend here." The restaurant had gone quiet, other diners pretending not to watch while their eyes tracked every movement. Sarah felt heat rising to her face, not for herself, but for the elderly man who had shrunk further into his seat, trying to become invisible. "I'll handle this," Sarah heard herself saying, though every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to let Margaret deal with it, to protect her job and her daughter's future. Margaret shot her a warning look, but Sarah was already moving toward the corner table. The elderly man looked up as she approached, and she saw something in his eyes that stopped her breath. Not fear or shame, but a deep, ancient sadness, as if he'd witnessed this scene 1,000 times before. "Sir," Sarah said softly, crouching beside his table so they were at eye level. "I'm so sorry about this situation. Would you be comfortable moving to a different table? We have a lovely spot by the window." "Why should he move?" Victor's voice boomed across the restaurant as he strode toward them, Rebecca following reluctantly behind. "Why are we negotiating with someone who clearly can't afford to be here? Look at him." Sarah stood, positioning herself between Victor and the elderly man. "Everyone who walks through that door is a valued customer." Victor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Valued customer? Sarah, isn't it? Let me explain something about value. I spend $30,000 a year in this restaurant. That's value. That..." He gestured dismissively toward the elderly man. "Is charity." "Actually," the elderly man spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but steady. "I was planning to order the soup." The simplicity of the statement landed like a bomb. Victor's face contorted with cruel amusement. The soup. Of course, the soup. The cheapest item on the menu. He turned to the growing audience of diners. "Do you see this? This is why establishments like Montclair need standards. Otherwise, anyone can just wander in off the street." Sarah felt her hands trembling, but she kept her voice level. "Sir, I need to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing other guests." "I'm disturbing?" Victor stepped closer, using his height to intimidate. "I'm not the problem here. The problem is that this restaurant has forgotten what exclusivity means. The problem is that people like him." He jabbed a finger toward the elderly man. "Think they can sit in places reserved for those who've actually earned it." "Earned it?" The words escaped Sarah before she could stop them. "You think human dignity is something that has to be earned?" Margaret appeared at Sarah's elbow, her face pale. "Sarah, perhaps you should take your break." "No," Victor interrupted, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Let her finish. I want to hear the philosophy of a waitress who thinks she understands how the world works." Sarah knew she should stop, should apologize, should retreat to the kitchen and let this moment pass. But she looked at the elderly man, at his trembling hands and dignified silence, and she thought of her daughter Emma, of all the times they'd sat in soup kitchens and food banks, of the people who'd looked at them with exactly the expression Victor was wearing now. "I understand that human decency doesn't come with a price tag," Sarah said quietly. "I understand that how we treat people says more about us than it does about them." Victor's smile vanished. "You want to talk about decency? Let's talk about it. Here's what's going to happen. Margaret is going to ask this gentleman to leave. He's going to go back to whatever shelter or street corner he came from, and life will return to normal." "Actually," Margaret said, her voice strained, "we can't ask a customer to leave without cause." "Then I'll do it." Victor turned to the elderly man. "You don't belong here. Everyone in this room knows it. Have some self-respect and leave." The elderly man started to stand, reaching for his worn jacket. Sarah watched his hands shake, saw the resignation in his movements, and something inside her broke. "Wait," she said, her voice stronger now. "Please, wait." She walked quickly to the kitchen, ignoring Margaret's protests. Daniel Foster, the head chef, looked up from his prep station as she entered. "I need bread," Sarah said. "The good bread, the kind we serve with the expensive meals." Daniel studied her face for a moment, then nodded, pulling a fresh loaf from the warmer. "Whatever's happening out there, be careful." Sarah returned to the dining room carrying the bread basket, along with butter, olive oil, and balsamic vinegar. She placed them in front of the elderly man with careful ceremony. "This is on the house," she said clearly, "while you decide what else you'd like to order." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Victor stared at her with genuine shock, then his face darkened with rage. "You just gave away food," he said slowly, "without authorization. That's theft." "It's hospitality," Sarah responded. "Something this restaurant was built on." "Margaret." Victor turned to the manager, his voice like ice. "Fire her, right now, or I walk out and never come back. And I'll make sure every person in my circle knows that Montclair has become a soup kitchen for vagrants." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, Sarah could see the apology there, the calculation, the inevitable surrender to money and power. "Sarah," Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, "I need you to collect your things." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt the world tilting, saw her daughter's face, thought about rent and bills and the fragile security she'd been building one shift at a time. "You're firing her?" Rebecca Stone spoke for the first time, her voice uncertain. "Victor, maybe that's too far. Maybe you should stay out of things you don't understand," Victor snapped. Then to Sarah, "You made your choice. You chose him over me. Now live with it." Sarah looked at the elderly man, who had tears streaming silently down his weathered face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean for this." "It's not your fault," Sarah said gently. She turned to Margaret. "I'll get my things." As she walked toward the break room, she heard Victor settling into his table, heard him ordering the most expensive wine, heard him laughing with Rebecca about the entertainment. She gathered her few possessions, an extra pair of shoes, a sweater, the photo of Emma she kept in her locker, and fought back tears. When she returned to the dining room to leave through the front entrance, she saw the elderly man still sitting at his table, the untouched bread in front of him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you," he said as she passed. Sarah managed a small smile. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Victor's voice followed her to the door. "That's where you're wrong, sweetheart. Dignity, like everything else in this world, has a price, and some people just can't afford it." Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cool evening air, leaving behind the warmth and light of Montclair restaurant. She had $18 in her wallet, 2 days until rent was due, and no idea how she'd explain to Emma why Mommy lost another job. What she didn't know, what no one in that restaurant knew, was that in exactly 3 minutes, the elderly man would stand up, remove his worn jacket, and reveal something that would change everything. But for now, Sarah just walked into the darkness, carrying her broken dreams and wondering how kindness had become such a dangerous luxury. Sarah had made it exactly half a block from Montclair restaurant when her phone buzzed. Emma's school. Her heart lurched as she answered, pressing the device against her ear with trembling fingers. "Ms. Bennett, this is Principal Hartley. Emma's fine, but we need to discuss her tuition payment. It's overdue, and I know," Sarah interrupted, her voice cracking. "I'll have it by tomorrow, I promise." "Ms. Bennett, you said that last week. We've been very patient, but—" "Please," Sarah whispered, aware of people passing on the sidewalk, aware of how desperate she sounded. "Just one more day." She ended the call before the principal could respond, before she could hear another polite rejection, another reminder of how precarious everything was. $18. That's what stood between her and complete collapse. Sarah turned to look back at the restaurant, its warm lights glowing against the darkening sky. Through the tall windows, she could see the silhouettes of diners, the comfortable world she'd just been expelled from. She should keep walking, go home, figure out how to explain to her daughter why everything was falling apart again. But something stopped her. Maybe it was guilt about the elderly man, wondering if he'd been forced to leave too. Maybe it was the desperate need to understand why her small act of kindness had cost her everything. Or maybe, she thought bitterly, she just wanted one last look at the life she'd never have. Sarah moved closer to the windows, staying in the shadows where the streetlights didn't quite reach. Inside, she could see Victor holding court at his table, Rebecca beside him, both of them laughing about something. Margaret stood near the host stand, her face still tight with stress. And in the corner, the elderly man remained at table 15, sitting with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Then, slowly, he stood up. Even from outside, Sarah could see every head in the restaurant turning toward him. The elderly man removed his worn jacket with deliberate care, folding it over the back of his chair. Underneath, he wore a simple shirt, unremarkable in every way. But something about his posture had changed. The trembling was gone. The hunched shoulders had straightened. He walked toward Victor's table with steady steps, and Sarah pressed closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Excuse me," the elderly man's voice carried clearly through the restaurant's sudden silence. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Victor looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to condescension. "I thought you'd left. The show's over, old man. Go find a shelter for the night." "My name," the elderly man said with quiet authority, "is Henry Morrison. Does that name mean anything to you?" Victor blinked, confused by the question. "Should it? Perhaps this will help." Henry reached into his pocket. Several diners gasped, but he pulled out only a wallet. From it, he extracted a business card and placed it on Victor's table. Rebecca leaned forward to look, and Sarah watched her face drain of color. The business associate grabbed Victor's arm, whispering urgently, but Victor brushed her off, picking up the card. "This is a joke," Victor said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Call the number," Henry suggested. "Ask for Jonathan Blake. Tell him Henry Morrison is standing in Montclair restaurant, and I'd like him to join us." "Victor," Rebecca's voice was panicked now. "That's the CEO of Morrison International Holdings. That's impossible," Victor finished. But he was already pulling out his phone with shaking hands. Sarah's mind raced. Morrison International Holdings. She'd heard the name before, seen it in financial news. knew it was one of the largest investment firms in the world. But this couldn't be the same Morrison. This was an elderly man in a worn jacket who'd ordered soup because it was the cheapest item on the menu. Victor made the call, his confidence visibly crumbling, as someone on the other end apparently confirmed what he didn't want to believe. When he hung up, his face had gone ashen. Victor couldn't seem to finish the sentence. I'm Henry Morrison, the elderly man confirmed. Worth approximately $8 billion, though the number fluctuates. Owner of Morrison International Holdings, yes. Also owner of 63 restaurants across 12 countries, including, as of 6 months ago, Montclair. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah felt her knees weaken, pressed her hand against the cold window glass for support. Margaret had gone perfectly still near the host stand, her professional mask completely shattered. You see, Henry continued, his voice still gentle but carrying an edge now, I make it a practice to visit my establishments unannounced. I dress simply, arrive without fanfare, and observe. I want to see how my restaurants treat everyone, not just the wealthy. I want to know if the values I insist upon, dignity, respect, hospitality, are actually practiced or just marketing slogans. Mr. Morrison, Margaret rushed forward, her voice desperate. I had no idea. If I'd known— That's exactly the point, Margaret, Henry interrupted. You didn't know. And when you didn't know, when you thought I was just a poor old man, you allowed me to be humiliated. You stood by while this gentleman, he gestured toward Victor, suggested I belonged in a shelter. You fired an employee for the crime of treating me with basic human decency. I was protecting the business, Margaret protested weakly, by violating every principle the business was built on. Henry's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Tell me, what kind of business thrives by choosing the cruelty of the wealthy over the kindness of the compassionate? Victor had remained frozen, but now he attempted to recover. Mr. Morrison, there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were. If I had, you would have treated me differently, Henry finished. Yes, I know. That's the problem. You believe respect is something people earn through wealth or status. But respect, Mr. Ashford, is something every human being deserves by virtue of being human. I apologize, Victor said quickly, too quickly, his earlier arrogance replaced by desperate calculation. I was out of line. It won't happen again. You're right about that, Henry agreed. It won't happen again. Because you're no longer welcome in any of my establishments. Not just Montclair, all 63 restaurants. Your name will be added to a list that will be distributed to every host's stand, every manager, every door. Rebecca stood abruptly. Mr. Morrison, I want to make it clear that I was merely accompanying Mr. Ashford. I didn't participate in— You were silent, Henry interrupted, which in the face of cruelty is its own form of participation. However, Ms. Stone, I've noticed over the years that you've occasionally tried to moderate his behavior, so I'll make you an offer. You can continue your association with Mr. Ashford and be banned alongside him. Or you can apologize sincerely, demonstrate genuine remorse, and remain welcome in my establishments. Rebecca didn't hesitate. I apologize. Not just to you, but to that young woman who was fired for doing the right thing. I should have spoken up. I should have done what she did. The young woman— Henry turned to Margaret. Where is Sarah Bennett? She left, Margaret whispered. After I terminated her employment. Henry's expression hardened. Did you pay her for the shift she worked today? Not yet. It would have been in her next— Get your cash drawer. Pay her for today, for the notice period she should have received, and add a bonus equivalent to 2 months' salary. Then bring me her file with her address. Mr. Morrison, Margaret was openly crying now, please don't fire me. I have a family. I was just trying to maintain standards. Standards? Henry's voice rose for the first time. You fired a single mother for feeding a hungry person. You chose a wealthy man's ego over a good woman's livelihood. You enforced exclusivity at the expense of humanity. These are not my standards, Margaret. These have never been my standards. Daniel emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Morrison, I'm Daniel Foster, head chef. I gave Sarah the bread. The restaurant held its breath, but Henry smiled for the first time. Then you understand what this restaurant is supposed to be. Tell me, Daniel, how would you run Montclair if you were manager? With the same excellence in food and service, Daniel responded without hesitation, but with the understanding that every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity. Wealth might determine what someone can order, but it should never determine whether they're treated as human. Margaret, Henry turned back to the former manager. You're relieved of your duties. Daniel will be interim manager starting immediately, with a full review for permanent placement within the week. He paused. You're not fired, Margaret. You're demoted to assistant manager, reporting to Daniel. You'll work every shift for the next 6 months, learning what hospitality actually means. If you can demonstrate genuine growth, we'll discuss your future. If not, we'll part ways. Outside, Sarah watched the drama unfold with mounting disbelief. This couldn't be real. The man she'd given bread to owned the restaurant, owned dozens of restaurants, was worth billions. A black car pulled up in front of Montclair, and a man in a business suit emerged. He strode through the entrance like he owned the place, and Sarah realized he probably did, or worked for someone who did. Mr. Morrison, the man's voice carried through the open door. I came as quickly as I could. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Jonathan, Henry assured him. But I need you to do something for me. There's a woman named Sarah Bennett who was just fired from this restaurant. I need you to find her immediately. She couldn't have gone far. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. They were looking for her. The owner of a multi-billion-dollar company was looking for her. She stepped back from the window, her mind spinning. This was too much, too surreal. She should go home, process this, figure out what it meant. But before she could move, the restaurant door opened, and Henry Morrison stepped out onto the sidewalk. His eyes found her immediately, as if he'd known exactly where she was. Sarah, he said gently, why are you standing out here in the cold? Sarah's voice failed her. I didn't want to intrude. Intrude? Henry walked toward her slowly, carefully, as if approaching a frightened animal. My dear, you're the only person in that entire restaurant who understood what Montclair is supposed to be, what all of my restaurants are supposed to be. Places where the food is excellent, the service is impeccable, and every human being, regardless of their bank account, is treated with respect. You own Montclair, Sarah said, still trying to make the reality fit in her mind. I do, and I'm truly sorry for what happened to you tonight. What Victor Ashford did was unconscionable. What Margaret allowed was inexcusable. But what you did, Henry's voice grew thick with emotion. What you did reminded me why I started this business in the first place. I just gave you bread, Sarah whispered. No, Henry shook his head. You gave me something far more valuable. You gave me hope. Hope that in a world increasingly obsessed with wealth and status, there are still people who understand that human dignity matters more than money. Jonathan appeared in the doorway. Mr. Morrison, Victor Ashford is asking if there's any way he can— No, Henry said firmly, and tell security to escort him out if he isn't gone in 60 seconds. He turned back to Sarah, his expression softening. I owe you an apology. You lost your job because of me, because I chose to test this restaurant anonymously, rather than announcing myself. The consequences of that decision fell on you, and that wasn't fair. You don't need to apologize, Sarah said. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did you, but you paid the price while I watched. Henry pulled out a business card, a different one from what he'd shown Victor. This has my personal number. I'd like to offer you a position, Sarah. Not as a waitress, though that's honorable work. I want to offer you something more. Sarah took the card with trembling fingers. I don't understand. I have 63 restaurants. All of them need someone who understands what hospitality really means. Someone who can train managers and staff, not just in service techniques, but in treating every guest with dignity. Someone who can be my eyes and ears, ensuring that my values aren't just words on a mission statement. You want me to— Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. I want you to be my director of hospitality culture. You'll visit each restaurant, evaluate how they treat all guests, implement training programs, and report directly to me. The salary is $200,000 a year, plus travel expenses, plus benefits that include a signing bonus to cover any immediate financial needs you might have. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. $200,000. She made $30,000 as a waitress. This was more money than she'd imagined earning in her lifetime. I can't, she heard herself saying. I'm not qualified. I don't have a degree. I'm just— You're exactly what I need, Henry interrupted gently. Degrees don't teach compassion, Sarah. Experience doesn't guarantee wisdom. But you, standing there tonight, choosing to risk everything to defend a stranger's dignity, that's the qualification that matters. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Why are you doing this? Because 50 years ago, I was the old man in worn clothes sitting in a restaurant, hoping no one would notice me, Henry said quietly. I was a veteran who'd lost everything, eating in a diner because they had a policy of never turning anyone away. A waitress named Dorothy saw me trying to make a single cup of coffee last for hours, and she brought me a full meal, told me it was a mistake order, that it would just be thrown away. I knew she was lying. I knew she'd paid for it herself. But she gave me something more important than food. She gave me dignity. His voice grew stronger. That meal gave me the strength to try again. I rebuilt my life, made my fortune, and promised myself I'd create restaurants that operated on Dorothy's principle. Everyone who walks through the door is worthy of respect. Tonight, you reminded me of Dorothy, and I want to make sure there are more people like you in my restaurants, not fewer. Sarah looked at the card in her hand, at the elegant script, at the number that could change everything. She thought of Emma, of the school tuition, of the rent and bills and constant fear. She thought of all the times she'd had to smile through humiliation, had to accept that this was just how the world worked. When do I start? She asked. Henry smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was a smile of pure joy. How about right now? Let's go back inside. There's someone you need to meet properly. Daniel, your new colleague. And there's someone who needs to apologize to you face to face. Inside the restaurant, Victor was being escorted out by security, his face purple with rage and humiliation. He glared at Sarah as he passed, but she met his eyes steadily, no longer afraid. This isn't over, Victor hissed. Actually, Henry said pleasantly, it is. Goodbye, Mr. Ashford. As Victor disappeared into the night, Henry turned to the remaining diners. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your evening. Your meals tonight are complimentary, with my gratitude for your patience. Then he raised his voice slightly. I also want to introduce you to Sarah Bennett, my new Director of Hospitality Culture.
Sarah represents everything Montclair stands for: excellence, dignity, and the understanding that every person who walks through our doors deserves respect. I hope you'll join me in welcoming her. The applause started slowly, then grew stronger.
Sarah stood in the center of the restaurant where she'd been fired minutes before, overwhelmed by the impossible reversal, by the kindness of strangers, by the fact that doing the right thing had somehow led to this moment. Thank you, she whispered to Henry. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for seeing me, Henry responded. When everyone else looked at an old man in worn clothes and saw nothing worth their time, you saw someone worthy of kindness. That made all the difference. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. But inside Montclair Restaurant, something fundamental had shifted. A lesson had been taught, not through words, but through consequences. And somewhere in the night, a little girl named Emma waited for her mother to come home, having no idea that everything had just changed forever. Sarah stood outside her apartment building at midnight, staring at the worn brick facade that had been home for the past 3 years. In her pocket was a cashier's check for $50,000, the signing bonus Henry had insisted she accept immediately. In her other pocket was a contract that would change everything, and in her heart was a mixture of joy and terror so intense she could barely breathe. The building superintendent, Mr. Patterson, was locking the main entrance when he spotted her. Ms. Bennett, bit late, isn't it? Is Emma still awake? Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. Mrs. Rodriguez on the 3rd floor watched Emma on Sarah's late shifts, and her daughter always refused to sleep until her mother came home. Saw her light on about 10 minutes ago, Mr. Patterson confirmed, then paused. Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Something like that, Sarah managed to smile. Something exactly like that. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs slowly, using the time to figure out how to explain the impossible to a child. Emma was 8 years old, wise beyond her years from necessity, but this was beyond anything either of them had experienced. Mrs. Rodriguez opened her door as Sarah passed. She's been asking for you every 15 minutes. Poor thing was worried. Thank you for watching her. I'll pay you tomorrow. Sarah stopped herself. Tomorrow she could actually pay. Tomorrow she wouldn't have to count pennies. I'll pay you now, actually, and extra for the worry. She handed Mrs. Rodriguez $200 from the cash Henry had given her for immediate expenses. The elderly woman's eyes widened. Sarah, this is too much. It's exactly right, Sarah said firmly. Thank you for everything you've done for us. Emma was sitting on their threadbare couch when Sarah entered, a library book open in her lap, but her eyes fixed on the door. She launched herself at her mother the moment Sarah appeared. Mommy, you're so late. I was scared something happened. Sarah held her daughter tight, breathing in the scent of the discount shampoo she'd stretched to last 3 months, feeling the small arms wrapped around her waist. Something did happen, baby. Something wonderful. For the next hour, sitting on that worn couch in their tiny apartment, Sarah told Emma everything. She watched her daughter's face cycle through disbelief, excitement, concern, and finally pure joy. So we can stay in our apartment? Emma's first question revealed more about their struggles than any adult conversation could. We can stay here, Sarah confirmed. Or we can find somewhere new, somewhere with your own bedroom, maybe a small yard. With a swing set? Emma's eyes were huge. With whatever you want. Sarah felt tears threatening again. The school called today about tuition. Emma's face fell. I know. Principal Hartley told me I might have to leave. The casual way her 8-year-old daughter accepted potential upheaval broke Sarah's heart. You're not leaving. I'm paying the tuition tomorrow. All of it. For this year and next year. Because of the old man you helped? Because kindness matters. Sarah corrected gently. Because treating people with dignity is always right, even when it costs us something, even when we're scared. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing. Mommy, you always told me to be kind even when it's hard. You showed me it's true. Sarah pulled her daughter close, overwhelmed by the realization that every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of teaching Emma to be good despite their circumstances had led to this. She'd been preparing her daughter for a better world while simultaneously showing her how to deserve it. Get some sleep, baby. Tomorrow, everything changes. But Sarah barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the water-stained ceiling, clutching the contract, terrified that she'd wake up and discover it had all been a beautiful dream. The next morning, reality proved more overwhelming than any dream. A car arrived at 8 o'clock, not a taxi, but a private car sent by Henry's office. The driver handed Sarah a phone with a note. For work purposes, Jonathan programmed in all the important numbers. Emma pressed her face against the window as they drove, watching the city transform from their working-class neighborhood to the business district. Is this really happening? I think so, Sarah whispered back. I really think so. Morrison International Holdings occupied the top 12 floors of the Bradford Tower downtown. The elevator ride seemed to last forever. Emma gripping Sarah's hand, both of them reflected in the polished brass doors. A woman in her best interview outfit that suddenly seemed shabby, and a little girl in her school uniform that had been washed so many times, the original color, was a memory. Ms. Bennett, Jonathan Blake waited at the reception area, impeccable in a tailored suit. But his smile was genuine as he crouched to Emma's level. You must be Emma. Your mom is pretty amazing. Did you know that? Emma nodded seriously. She's the best mommy in the world. I believe it. Jonathan straightened. Sarah, Henry's in a meeting, but he wanted me to get you started. First, let's handle the practical matters. The practical matters took 3 hours. Sarah signed documents, received identification badges, sat through orientations about benefits that seemed too generous to be real. Full health coverage, education fund for Emma, retirement contributions, travel allowances. She was introduced to department heads whose annual salaries she couldn't comprehend, all of whom treated her with respect that felt unearned. Stop that, Jonathan said quietly as they walked to her new office. Stop thinking you don't deserve this. Henry doesn't make mistakes about people. If he believes in you, that's not charity. It's recognition. The office was modest, but professional, with a window view of the city. On the desk was a framed photograph. Sarah realized with a shock that it was from last night, a security camera image of her giving bread to Henry. Underneath, in Henry's handwriting, "This is what excellence looks like." Mr. Morrison wanted you to remember why you're here, Jonathan explained. Not because of credentials or experience, but because you understand something most people forget, that dignity isn't negotiable. A knock at the door interrupted them. Henry Morrison entered, looking nothing like the frail elderly man from last night. Dressed in a simple but well-fitted suit, he carried himself with quiet authority, but his eyes held the same gentle warmth. Sarah, good morning. And this must be Emma. Emma hid slightly behind her mother, but managed a small wave. Henry smiled and pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket. A friend of mine owns a bookstore. He set aside some books he thought a young lady who loves reading might enjoy. He handed the package to Emma. No obligation to like them, but he assured me they're excellent adventures. Emma looked at her mother for permission. Sarah nodded, overwhelmed again by this man's thoughtfulness. Emma carefully unwrapped the package to reveal 3 hardcover books. New books, not library discards or thrift store finds. Thank you, Emma whispered. You're very welcome. Henry turned to Sarah. I have something to show you. Jonathan, could you take Emma to the employee lounge? I believe there's hot chocolate and pastries. When they were alone, Henry gestured for Sarah to follow him. They took the elevator down, then another elevator Sarah hadn't noticed. Older, service elevator that descended below street level. Where are we going? Sarah asked. To the beginning, Henry replied cryptically. They emerged in what appeared to be an archive. Rows of filing cabinets, boxes of documents, and on one wall, photographs spanning decades. Henry led her to a specific section, where a faded color photograph showed a small diner, its neon sign reading, Dorothy's Place. This is where it started, Henry said softly. 1975. I'd been back from Vietnam for 6 months. Couldn't hold a job, couldn't sleep, couldn't see a future. I'd spent my last money on a bus ticket to the city, hoping to find my brother. Found out when I arrived that he'd died 2 years earlier and nobody had known how to reach me. Sarah listened in silence, sensing the importance of this moment. I walked into Dorothy's Place with 35 cents, enough for coffee. The place was nearly empty, early afternoon, the dead time between lunch and dinner. I sat at the counter for 4 hours, nursing that one cup while Dorothy worked around me. She never pressured me to leave, never made me feel like I was taking up space. Henry's voice grew thick with emotion. Finally, closing time came. I stood to leave, and Dorothy stopped me. She brought out a full meal, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pie. Told me it was a mistake order, that it would just go to waste. I knew she was lying. I could see it in her eyes. But she gave me something more important than food. She gave me the dignity to accept help. What happened? Sarah asked quietly. I ate that meal. I cried. And Dorothy sat across from me and listened to everything I needed to say. When I finished, she told me about a veterans support group, about a job opening at a local warehouse, about a boarding house that charged fair rates. She gave me a roadmap back to life. Henry pulled another photograph from the wall, a young man in his 20s, thin and haunted, but with determination in his eyes, standing next to a smiling woman with kind eyes. That's me. That's Dorothy. She saved my life that day, and she made me promise something. She said, Henry, when you find your feet again, remember that everyone fighting a hard battle deserves kindness. Pass it on. Did you stay in touch? Sarah asked. For 30 years. She became like a mother to me. When I started my first business, she was my first investor. $500 she'd saved over years. When I opened my first restaurant, I named it Dorothy's Place in her honor. Every restaurant I've opened since carries her philosophy. Everyone who walks through the door deserves respect. Where is she now? Henry's expression grew sad. She passed away 15 years ago. Heart attack, quick and painless, the way she would have wanted. But before she died, she made me promise to keep the tradition alive, to keep testing my restaurants, to keep ensuring they lived up to her values. He turned to Sarah fully. Last night, when you gave me that bread, when you defended my dignity knowing it would cost you your job, you reminded me so much of Dorothy that it hurt. That's not just why I hired you, Sarah. It's why I know you're the right person for this role. You understand what Dorothy understood, that everyone has worth, that kindness isn't conditional on circumstances. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. I'm afraid I'll fail. I'm afraid I don't know enough. Dorothy didn't have a college degree. She'd never managed anything except a small diner. But she understood people. She understood that the measure of a society is how it treats those who have the least. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder. You have that same understanding. Everything else can be learned. They returned upstairs to find Emma in the conference room, surrounded by several employees who were apparently engaged in a very serious discussion about which book she should read first. We've been debating for 20 minutes, one woman explained. It's quite intense. Sarah's heart swelled watching her daughter interact with these professional adults who were treating her opinions as if they mattered. This was the world she wanted for Emma, a world where respect wasn't earned through wealth or status, but given as a birthright. Sarah, Henry interrupted her thoughts. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Actually, somewhere I'd like you to visit. An hour later, Sarah found herself standing outside a restaurant called the Sterling Plate, another of Morrison International's properties. This one was in a business district, catering to lunch crowds of executives and professionals. Henry had sent her here alone with specific instructions. Observe, just observe. Sarah entered wearing casual business attire, looking like any other customer. The host greeted her professionally, and she requested a table for one. But as she waited, she noticed something. A young man approached the host's stand, clearly nervous. His clothing was clean but worn, his shoes held together with glue. He spoke quietly to the host, who frowned. I'm sorry, sir. The host's voice carried to where Sarah waited. We have a business casual dress code. I'm afraid I can't seat you. I have money, the young man said, showing cash. I've been saving. It's my mother's birthday, and she always wanted to eat somewhere nice. I thought, I understand, but policy is policy. Perhaps you could try the diner 2 blocks down. Sarah watched the young man's face crumble, watched him nod and turn to leave. And in that moment, she understood why Henry had sent her here. This wasn't just about observing. This was her first test. She stepped forward. Excuse me. The host turned, professional smile in place. Yes, ma'am. Your table will be ready in just a moment. Actually, Sarah pulled out the business card Henry had given her, the one that identified her as Director of Hospitality Culture. I need to speak with your manager. Now. The host's expression shifted from professional courtesy to confusion to dawning concern as she read the card. Of course, right away. As the host hurried off, Sarah turned to the young man, who was watching with bewilderment. Please don't leave, she said gently. Would you wait just a few minutes? Ma'am, I don't want to cause trouble. You're not causing trouble. Someone else is, and we're going to fix it. The manager appeared, a man in his 40s with the same professional polish as everyone else in the Morrison empire. But his eyes held calculation as he approached. Ms. Bennett, I'm Thomas Reeves, General Manager. Is there a problem? Sarah gestured to the young man. This gentleman was turned away because of his clothing. He has money to pay. He wants to celebrate his mother's birthday. Why was he refused service? Thomas glanced at the young man with barely concealed disdain. We maintain certain standards. Those standards include appropriate attire. And who defines appropriate? Sarah asked quietly. The restaurant has guidelines. Does Mr. Morrison know you're turning away paying customers because their clothes aren't expensive enough? Thomas's expression hardened. Mr. Morrison understands that exclusivity is part of our brand. Not everyone belongs in every space. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity she'd never experienced before. This was why Henry had hired her, not to maintain the status quo, but to challenge it. You're right that not everyone belongs in every space, Sarah said clearly. People who judge others by their clothing don't belong in Morrison restaurants. People who equate wealth with worth don't belong in our spaces. And managers who've forgotten that dignity is the foundation of hospitality don't belong in positions of authority. Thomas's face flushed. You can't. I can. Sarah pulled out her phone, calling the number Jonathan had programmed. Jonathan? I'm at the Sterling Plate. I need you to review Thomas Reeves' performance record and prepare termination paperwork. Immediately. She hung up before Thomas could respond, then turned to the young man. What's your name? Marcus, he whispered. Marcus Thompson. Marcus, I apologize on behalf of Morrison International. This restaurant failed you today. But if you'll give us another chance, I'd like to personally ensure you and your mother have the birthday celebration she deserves, with a private table, complimentary meal, and a genuine apology. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. Why are you doing this? Sarah thought of Dorothy giving Henry a meal he didn't have to feel ashamed to accept. She thought of Henry giving her a chance she'd never imagined deserving. She thought of all the invisible people she'd served alongside, all the workers whose dignity was conditional on customer whims. "Because someone did it for me," she said simply, "and now it's my turn to pass it on." Behind her, Thomas Reeves was protesting, demanding to speak with Henry directly, insisting this was a misunderstanding. But Sarah ignored him. She was focused on Marcus, on ensuring that this young man understood that his worth wasn't determined by his wardrobe, that his mother's birthday mattered, that kindness existed in the world. Later that evening, after Marcus and his mother had enjoyed their meal, after Thomas had been escorted from the building, after Sarah had spent hours writing detailed notes on everything she'd observed, Henry called her personally. "Well done," he said simply. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," Sarah admitted. "I fired someone today. I changed someone's policy. I used power I've never had before. And it felt right. It felt like what should have been done all along." That's the difference between authority and power, Sarah. Authority is given by position. Power is taken through conviction. You had the authority to act, but you had the power because you believe in something bigger than policy. You believe in people. Sarah looked at Emma sleeping on the couch, the new books clutched in her arms. She thought of Marcus and his mother, of their joy at being treated with respect. She thought of all the restaurants still needing this lesson, all the managers still equating exclusivity with exclusion. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked. "Yes," Henry confirmed. "But you've already proven you're ready. Dorothy would be proud. I know I am." After the call ended, Sarah sat in their small apartment, soon to be replaced by something better. But for tonight, still home. She thought about the journey from fired waitress to corporate director, from invisible to influential, from powerless to empowered. And she understood, finally, what Henry had been teaching her all along, that transformation wasn't about changing yourself to fit the world. It was about changing the world to reflect the values you'd always held. Tomorrow, she would visit another restaurant, and another, and another. Each one a chance to pass on the kindness that had saved both her and Henry. Each one a promise to Dorothy that her legacy would continue. But tonight, she was simply a mother, watching her daughter sleep, grateful beyond words that doing the right thing had somehow led to this impossible moment of grace. 3 weeks into her new position, Sarah Bennett stood in the conference room of Morrison International Holdings, facing 12 restaurant managers whose expressions ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Behind her, a presentation displayed statistics she'd compiled from visits to 15 different Morrison establishments. The numbers told a story that made her stomach churn. "In the past 3 weeks," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I've documented 47 incidents across our restaurants where customers were turned away, ignored, or treated poorly based solely on their appearance. 47 times we failed to live up to the values Mr. Morrison founded this company on." "With all due respect," interrupted Gerald Whitmore, manager of the flagship Morrison's Prime downtown, "those values sound wonderful in theory, but in practice, we have to maintain standards. Our clientele expects a certain atmosphere." "Your clientele," Sarah responded, pulling up a news slide showing revenue data, "includes people from all walks of life. And the data shows that restaurants practicing inclusive hospitality have 15% higher customer satisfaction and 20% better staff retention." "Where did you get these numbers?" demanded Patricia Volkov, whose upscale seafood restaurant had the worst record of discrimination in the entire company. "From exit interviews with former staff, customer feedback surveys that were never properly analyzed, and comparison with competitors who've embraced dignified service." Sarah met Patricia's glare steadily. "The question isn't whether inclusive hospitality works. It's why we've been resisting it. Because we're not a charity," Gerald snapped. "We're a business, and businesses require standards." "Standards," Sarah repeated, her voice growing stronger. "Let me tell you about standards. Marcus Thompson, a young man saving for months to celebrate his mother's birthday, met your standards for payment. He had cash. He was polite. He made a reservation. But he didn't meet your standards for appearance, so he was turned away. Is that the standard Mr. Morrison wants? The conference room door opened, and Henry Morrison entered quietly, taking a seat in the back. Sarah felt a jolt of anxiety but continued. I've spent the past 3 weeks eating in your restaurants, watching how you treat different customers. I've seen families with children seated near kitchen doors where noise makes conversation impossible. I've seen elderly diners ignored for 40 minutes while younger, wealthier-looking customers receive immediate attention. I've seen staff members speak to some guests with warmth and others with barely concealed contempt. You're exaggerating, Patricia protested. Sarah pulled out her phone and projected a video onto the screen. It showed Patricia's restaurant, captured from Sarah's table 3 days ago. An elderly woman in simple clothing asked for a menu. The host's response was audible. Ma'am, our entrees start at $60. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. Patricia's face went pale as the video continued, showing the woman's dignified response. I'm aware of your prices. I'm celebrating my 50th wedding anniversary. My husband passed away last year and we always dreamed of dining here. The room watched in silence as the host grudgingly seated the woman at the worst table in the restaurant, near the restroom, where she was subsequently ignored by her server for 25 minutes. I eventually served her myself, Sarah said quietly, stopping the video. Her name is Helen Crawford. She's a retired teacher who saved for 6 months for this one meal. And your staff treated her like she didn't belong because her dress came from a department store instead of a boutique. Henry stood from the back of the room, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Sarah. That will be all for now. Sarah gathered her materials with shaking hands, certain she'd overstepped, pushed too hard, revealed her inexperience too clearly. As she headed for the door, Henry's voice stopped her. Actually, Sarah, please stay. Everyone else, you're dismissed. Except Patricia and Gerald. You two remain seated. The other managers filed out quickly, relief evident on their faces. Patricia and Gerald exchanged worried glances but stayed put. Henry waited until the door closed before speaking. Sarah, that presentation was one of the most professionally devastating things I've witnessed in my 40 years in business. You systematically dismantled every excuse, every rationalization, every defensive argument. It was brutal. Sarah's heart sank. Sir, I apologize if It was also completely correct, Henry continued, a smile breaking through his serious expression. And long overdue. Patricia, Gerald, you're both terminated effective immediately. Patricia shot to her feet. You can't fire us for maintaining standards. I'm firing you for betraying them, Henry corrected coldly. Morrison International was built on the principle that every human being deserves dignity. You've spent years subverting that principle while I trusted you to uphold it. That trust was misplaced. This is because of her? Gerald gestured dismissively at Sarah. Some waitress who worked here for 5 minutes? No. Henry's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. This is because of you. Because you had years to do the right thing and chose not to. Because you confused exclusivity with cruelty. Because you forgot that our success comes from being better than our competitors, not from being crueler to our customers. After security escorted the former managers out, Henry turned to Sarah with concern. How are you holding up? I just got 2 people fired, Sarah whispered. Again. You exposed 2 people who deserve to be fired, Henry corrected gently. There's a difference, but I know this isn't easy. Let's take a walk. They left the building, walking toward a small park 2 blocks away. The afternoon sun filtered through autumn leaves, and for a moment, Sarah could almost forget the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. When I gave you this position, Henry said as they walked, I knew you'd face resistance. People who've built careers on exclusivity don't surrender their power easily. But I also knew you had something they didn't. What's that? Conviction. You believe in dignity, the way some people believe in gravity, as a fundamental force that can't be negotiated away. Henry sat on a bench, gesturing for Sarah to join him. That conviction is going to cost you sometimes. People will call you naive, idealistic, unrealistic. They'll say business requires compromise. Maybe they're right, Sarah said quietly. Maybe I'm too inexperienced to understand how things really work. Sarah, look at me. Henry waited until she met his eyes. Experience can teach you 1,000 ways to rationalize cruelty. Experience can make you cynical, make you believe that kindness is weakness. but you have something more valuable than experience. You have integrity that hasn't been corroded by years of compromise. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan. Emergency at Montclair. Margaret asking for you specifically. They returned to find Margaret Chen waiting in the Morrison Holdings lobby, her eyes red from crying. She stood when she saw Sarah, her posture a mixture of shame and desperation. I know I have no right to ask, Margaret began, but I need help. I need advice. I don't know how to do this. Sarah led her to a private conference room, Henry following quietly. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her professional mask completely shattered. For 6 weeks, I've been assistant manager, Margaret said. Daniel has been patient, but I see it in his eyes. He doesn't trust me. The staff doesn't trust me. And I don't blame them. I fired you for doing the right thing. I spent years enforcing policies that hurt people. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked, not unkindly. Because yesterday, something happened that made me understand what I'd become. Margaret pulled out her phone, showing them a photo of a teenage girl. This is my daughter, Lily. She's 16. Yesterday, she tried to go to a restaurant downtown, not one of ours, with her friends. They were dressed casually, just teenagers being teenagers. The host turned them away, said they didn't meet the dress code. Margaret's voice broke. Lily came home crying. She said she'd never felt so small, so worthless, so judged for something that had nothing to do with who she is. And I realized I'd done that. To dozens of people, maybe hundreds. I'd made them feel exactly how my daughter felt. What do you want from me? Sarah asked. Teach me, Margaret whispered. Teach me how to be better, how to see people the way you see them, how to put dignity above profit. I know I don't deserve your help, but my daughter deserves a mother who isn't, she struggled with the word, who isn't cruel. Sarah looked at Henry, who nodded almost imperceptibly. She turned back to Margaret, seeing not the woman who'd fired her, but a mother desperate to be worthy of her daughter's respect. Okay, Sarah said, but this isn't going to be easy. Real change never is. For the next 2 hours, Sarah and Margaret talked about specific incidents, about systemic problems, about the subtle ways discrimination manifested in restaurant service. Henry left them alone, understanding that this was Sarah's moment to teach, to lead, to transform not just policies, but hearts. Tomorrow, Sarah finally said, you're going to personally apologize to every staff member you mistreated. You're going to implement new training protocols, and you're going to spend 1 shift per week working as a server, so you remember what it feels like to be on the receiving end of customer cruelty. I'll do it, Margaret agreed without hesitation. All of it. As Margaret left, Sarah felt exhausted, but strangely hopeful. Transformation was possible. Even for those who'd enforced cruelty, redemption could be found if they were willing to do the hard work. But her hope was short-lived. That evening, Sarah received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, You've made powerful enemies. The email contained links to social media posts, blog articles, and business forums, all attacking her, Morrison International, and Henry personally. The campaign was coordinated, vicious, and clearly funded by people with resources. Sarah Bennett, former waitress with no business credentials, is destroying one of the city's finest restaurant groups, read one article. Morrison's misguided dignity initiative is code for lowering standards and driving away discerning clientele. Another post showed photographs of her and Emma, captioned, Is this who should be making decisions about luxury dining? A single mother who couldn't even keep a waitressing job. Sarah's hands trembled as she read post after post, each one more personal and cruel than the last. Someone had investigated her background, found her financial struggles, discovered every embarrassing detail of her past. Her phone rang. It was Jonathan. Sarah, don't read anything else. It's a coordinated attack, and we know who's behind it. Victor, Sarah guessed. Victor and his business associates. They're using their media connections to destroy your credibility and damage Morrison International's reputation. They're calling for boycotts, pressuring suppliers, spreading rumors. This is my fault, Sarah said, fighting tears. I should have been more careful, more diplomatic. You should have been exactly who you are, Jonathan interrupted firmly. And Henry wants you to know that this changes nothing. We're not backing down. But that night, lying awake while Emma slept peacefully beside her, Sarah wondered if conviction was enough. She'd started this journey believing that doing the right thing would be sufficient. Now she was learning that doing the right thing often meant enduring attacks from those who profited from the wrong thing. Her phone lit up with another message, this time from an unknown number. "Quit now, and we'll leave you alone. Continue, and we'll make sure you never work in this city again. We'll make sure everyone knows what a fraud you are. Think about your daughter." The threat against Emma turned Sarah's fear into fury. She screenshot the message and forwarded it to Jonathan, then sat up, her mind racing. They thought threatening her daughter would make her retreat. They thought exposing her humble background would shame her into silence. They thought she'd crumble under pressure because she was just a waitress who'd gotten lucky. They didn't understand that being a waitress had taught her more about human nature than any business school. That struggling to provide for Emma had given her strength they'd never comprehend. That having nothing to lose meant she couldn't be bought or intimidated. Sarah opened her laptop and began writing. Not a defensive response to the attacks, but something more powerful. A detailed account of what she'd witnessed in Morrison restaurants, the changes being implemented, and the philosophy behind them. She wrote about Dorothy and Henry, about Marcus and his mother, about Helen Crawford celebrating her anniversary alone, about every invisible person she'd ever served who deserved better. She wrote until dawn, pouring her conviction onto the page. When she finished, she sent it to Jonathan with a simple note. "Publish this. Let them know who we are and what we stand for. No apologies. No retreat." As the sun rose over the city, Sarah watched Emma wake up, watched her daughter stretch and smile, watched her reach for one of the books Henry had given her. Emma had no idea that powerful people were trying to destroy her mother's career. She only knew that her mother had taught her to be kind, to stand up for what's right, to believe that every person has worth. And Sarah realized that this, her daughter's faith in goodness, was what she was really fighting for. Not just policy changes or corporate culture shifts, but a world where Emma could grow up believing that kindness matters more than power, that dignity isn't negotiable, that doing the right thing is always worth the cost. "Mommy," Emma said softly, "you look tired." "I am tired, baby," Sarah admitted. "But I'm okay. Sometimes the right fight is worth losing sleep over." "Are you fighting for good people?" Emma asked with the clarity only children possess. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "I'm fighting for all the good people who've been made to feel small, and I'm not going to stop. Because that's what Dorothy had done for Henry. That's what Henry had done for her. And that's what she would do for every Marcus, every Helen, every person who walked into a Morrison restaurant believing they didn't belong." The battle was just beginning. But Sarah Bennett, former waitress and current director of hospitality culture, was ready for war. The article Sarah wrote went viral within hours of publication. Not because of marketing or paid promotion, but because it resonated with something fundamental in people who'd felt invisible, dismissed, judged by their appearance rather than their character. Within 24 hours, it had been shared 3 million times, translated into 17 languages, and sparked conversations across every social media platform. But the real impact came from unexpected places. Sarah arrived at Morrison Holdings the next morning to find the lobby filled with people. Not protesters, as Victor's campaign had promised, but supporters, restaurant workers from across the city, former customers who'd experienced discrimination, families who'd been turned away from establishments they'd saved months to afford. Ms. Bennett, a young woman, pushed forward, holding a handwritten sign that read, "Dignity Matters." "I'm a server at Richmond's downtown. After reading your article, 12 of us submitted formal complaints about how our management treats customers. They're being investigated now. You gave us courage to speak up." An elderly man approached next, tears in his eyes. "My name is Robert Chen. I'm Marcus Thompson's grandfather. What you did for my grandson, giving him dignity when others took it away, our family will never forget." Henry appeared at Sarah's side, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "There's someone else here to see you." In the conference room, Sarah's heart raced as she followed him upstairs. Had Victor come personally? Was this a confrontation? But the person waiting in the conference room wasn't Victor. It was Rebecca Stone, Victor's former business associate, and she wasn't alone. With her were 6 other business leaders, all of whom Sarah recognized from the city's elite circles. "Ms. Bennett," Rebecca stood, her expression serious but sincere. "We've come to apologize and to pledge support." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "I don't understand." "Victor's campaign against you backfired," explained James Morrison, no relation to Henry, who owned a chain of hotels. "When he started attacking you publicly, trying to discredit you, many of us looked closer at what you were actually doing. We read your article, we examined our own businesses, and we realized we'd been complicit in the same cruelty." Rebecca took a breath. "After that night at Montclair, I went home and couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how I'd stayed silent while Victor humiliated that elderly man, how I'd prioritized my business relationship over basic human decency. Your article made me realize I had a choice: continue as I'd been, or become someone my children could be proud of. We want to join your initiative," James continued. "All of us. We want to implement the same dignity standards across our properties. We want to train our staff the way you're training Morrison's staff. We want to be part of the solution instead of perpetuating the problem." Sarah looked at Henry, who nodded encouragingly. "What about Victor?" she asked. "He won't stop attacking us." "Actually," Rebecca said quietly, "Victor's campaign collapsed last night. Several journalists investigated his claims against you and discovered he'd been paying for fake reviews, manipulating social media, and threatening business partners who refused to join his boycott. The media turned on him. His board of directors is discussing his removal. He's facing potential legal action for defamation and harassment." "I didn't want to destroy him," Sarah whispered. "I just wanted him to stop hurting people." "You didn't destroy him," Henry said gently. "He destroyed himself. You simply refused to be destroyed by him. That's different." Over the next weeks, Sarah watched as transformation rippled through the restaurant industry. The 7 business leaders who'd met with her implemented sweeping changes. Stories emerged of staff members empowered to defend customer dignity, of families enjoying meals in places they'd once been turned away from, of elderly diners receiving the respect they deserved. But the most profound transformation was Margaret Chen. 2 months after her breakdown in Sarah's office, Margaret requested a meeting. When Sarah arrived at Montclair, she found the restaurant transformed, not physically, but atmospherically. Staff members moved with confidence rather than fear. Customers of all backgrounds filled the dining room, treated with equal warmth and professionalism. "I want to show you something," Margaret said, leading Sarah to a corner table where a young family sat. Parents in simple work clothes, 3 children excited by the fancy menu. Sarah watched as Margaret personally served them, explaining dishes with genuine enthusiasm, making recommendations based on their preferences rather than their budget. When the youngest child accidentally spilled water, Margaret cleaned it up without judgment, even bringing the girl a special dessert for being such a brave diner. Later, in Margaret's office, Sarah saw the transformation more clearly. Gone were the corporate efficiency charts focused solely on profit margins. In their place were photos of staff members, customer feedback highlighting dignified service, and a handwritten quote from Dorothy. "Everyone who walks through our door is a guest, not a transaction." "Lily started volunteering at a soup kitchen," Margaret said softly. "She comes home telling me stories about the people she meets, their dignity, their strength, their humanity. And I realize she's teaching me what you taught me, that worth isn't measured by wealth." "How did Daniel respond to your changes?" Sarah asked. "He promoted me back to co-manager," Margaret smiled, genuine joy lighting her face. "Not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. Every shift, I work alongside the staff. Every complaint, I handle with compassion. Every customer, I see as someone who deserves respect. It's exhausting, but it's the first time in my career I've felt proud of who I am at work." The true culmination came 6 months after that night when Sarah had given Henry bread. Henry called a company-wide meeting, bringing together management from all 63 Morrison restaurants in a hotel conference center that felt more like a celebration than a corporate gathering. Emma sat in the front row, wearing a new dress she'd picked out herself. Not expensive, but chosen with the same care Sarah had taught her to apply to everything in life. Beside her sat Marcus Thompson and his mother, Helen Crawford, and dozens of other customers whose lives had been touched by the transformation. Henry stood at the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd with an expression Sarah had come to recognize, the same expression he'd worn that night at Montclair when she'd defended his dignity. 50 years ago, Henry began, his voice strong despite his age, a waitress named Dorothy saved my life with a simple act of kindness. She gave me a meal I couldn't afford and dignity I desperately needed. I built this company to honor her legacy, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of her most important lesson, that systems don't create dignity. People do. He gestured to Sarah. 6 months ago, I walked into one of my restaurants dressed as a poor old man, expecting to find Dorothy's values alive and well. Instead, I found that we'd become exactly what we'd sworn never to be, a place where dignity had a price tag. I was humiliated, dismissed, treated as worthless, and I was ready to accept defeat, to believe that maybe the world had simply changed too much. But then Sarah Bennett, a waitress earning minimum wage with everything to lose, made a choice. She chose kindness over safety. She chose my dignity over her job. She chose to be Dorothy when no one else would. And that choice changed everything. The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as Emma reached over to squeeze her hand. Today, Henry continued once the applause subsided, I'm announcing the Dorothy's Promise Initiative. Every Morrison restaurant will display Dorothy's photograph in a place of honor. Every staff member will receive training not just in service but in dignity. Every customer, regardless of their appearance, their budget, or their background, will be treated with the respect Dorothy believed every human being deserves. He pulled out a framed photograph, the same one Sarah had seen in the archive, young Henry and Dorothy standing in front of her diner. This is the woman who changed my life. And this, he gestured to Sarah, is the woman who reminded me why that change mattered. Sarah Bennett isn't just our director of hospitality culture. She's proof that Dorothy's legacy lives on in people who choose kindness, even when it costs them everything. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Sarah found herself standing by a window overlooking the city. Emma joined her, slipping her small hand into her mother's. "Mommy, are you happy?" Emma asked. Sarah thought about the question. 6 months ago, she'd been fired for doing the right thing, terrified about rent and school tuition, convinced that kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Now she stood in a room full of people, committed to transforming how the restaurant industry treated everyone who walked through its doors. Yes, baby, I'm happy. But more than that, I'm proud. Proud of the work we're doing. Proud of the people who chose to change. Proud that you get to grow up in a world where more people believe dignity matters. Will Mr. Ashford ever say sorry? Emma asked with a child's directness. Sarah looked across the room and realized, with shock, that Victor Ashford had actually come. He stood near the back, alone, looking smaller somehow than he had that night at Montclair. His empire had crumbled. His board had indeed removed him. Several business partners had severed ties, and the media scrutiny had exposed decades of treating people as disposable. Sarah excused herself from Emma and walked toward Victor, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she'd say, didn't know if she even should speak to him. Victor saw her approaching and straightened, his expression guarded. "I suppose you're here to gloat." "No," Sarah said quietly. "I'm here to ask if you understand yet." "Understand what? That being decent is more profitable than I thought? That your little campaign worked?" His voice was bitter, defensive. "Understand that the people you humiliated were human beings with stories, with dignity, with worth, that had nothing to do with their bank accounts." Sarah kept her voice gentle, remembering Henry's lesson about power versus cruelty. "Henry gave you respect for years because you were wealthy. I gave Henry respect for 5 minutes because he was human. Only one of those things mattered." Victor's facade cracked slightly. "I lost everything." "No," Sarah corrected. "You lost money, status, power. Those aren't everything. And they're all things you can rebuild if you choose to do it differently. If you choose to treat people the way Dorothy treated Henry, the way I treated you with respect even now, after everything you did." She turned to walk away, then paused. "The door isn't closed, Mr. Ashford. Margaret found her way back. Rebecca found hers. If you genuinely want to become someone who builds instead of destroys, who elevates instead of humiliates, there's a path. But you have to want it for the right reasons. Not for redemption. Not for profit. but because you finally understand that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about and deserves kindness regardless. Victor didn't respond, but something in his eyes suggested Sarah's words had landed. Whether they'd take root and grow was up to him. Henry approached as Sarah walked away from Victor. That was generous. Dorothy was generous with you. You were generous with me. I'm just passing it on. Sarah smiled. That's how it works, isn't it? One act of kindness creating ripples that spread further than we can see. That's exactly how it works. Henry handed her an envelope. This is from Dorothy's family. They wanted you to have it. Inside was a handwritten letter from Dorothy herself, dated a month before her death, addressed to whoever carries on after Henry. Sarah read aloud, her voice shaking. If you're reading this, it means Henry found someone who understands what really matters. Someone who chose kindness when it was difficult. Someone who saw a person everyone else dismissed and recognized their humanity. Thank you for proving that the world still creates people like you. Thank you for showing Henry, and through him, showing everyone, that dignity isn't a luxury. It's a birthright. Keep fighting for the invisible ones. They're counting on you. Sarah folded the letter carefully, holding it against her heart. Around her, the celebration continued. Staff members sharing stories of positive changes, customers expressing gratitude, business leaders pledging to implement dignity standards. But in this quiet moment, Sarah felt connected to Dorothy across time and death, part of an unbroken chain of people who believed that how we treat each other defines who we are. Emma ran up, breathless with excitement. Mommy! Mr. Morrison said I can help design the new training program. He wants kids to teach the adults about treating everyone nicely. Sarah laughed, picking up her daughter and spinning her around. That's perfect, baby. Because you already know what some adults forget, that everyone deserves kindness. As the sun set over the city, Sarah stood with Henry and Emma, watching lights come on in buildings across the skyline. Somewhere in those buildings, people were working in restaurants, serving customers, making choices about how to treat others. And because of Dorothy's kindness 50 years ago, because of Henry's commitment to her legacy, because of Sarah's choice to defend a stranger's dignity, more of those choices would be kind ones. What happens now? Emma asked. Henry and Sarah exchanged a knowing smile. Now, Sarah said, we keep our promise, Dorothy's promise, that everyone who walks through our doors, through any door, will be seen, valued, and treated with the dignity they deserve. That's what happens now. That's what happens always. And in that moment, with her daughter in her arms and a future full of possibilities ahead, Sarah Bennett understood what Dorothy had known all along, that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or status or power. It's the simple, revolutionary act of treating every human being as if they matter. Because they do. They always did. They always will.